Previously on the Cyber Guys.
You don't create this level of fear, concern, angst. The motivation to get people off their tuckuses to do something is just not there.
What is the number one vector of attack?
Users exploiting the human weakness. Exactly. This is Y2K all over again.
But ultimately, what got down to my ears was we're all gonna die.
There's a weird tension, balance, dissonance even between what people need to know and need to be worried about and what people are worried about and what people do know.
Everyday user, some of the very same business leaders that do not think cyber risk is very important to pay attention to.
They are part of the problem, no question.
They are part of the problem. And so when you take that and you marry that up with the idea that there's a catastrophe coming, there's not much you can do about it, the problem is systemic, you as an everyday user are going to hear those headlines and go, welcome back, folks, to the Cyber Guys podcast, the cybersecurity podcast for everybody. We're back with part 2 of our discussion about the World Economic Forum's Global Cybersecurity Outlook for 2023. But first, if this is your first time, welcome. If you're coming back, we appreciate you coming on back. Make sure you hit that like button. And if you're not subscribed, become a subscriber so you don't miss out on any of the amazing content that we're putting out every single week. Now, that's out of the way. Let's get into it. I know you're absolutely right. You make an extremely cogent point, right? That attack vectors are variable, are the variable, right? But we do know that there is one vector that is favored by most hackers, and that's what? The human. And the worst thing that we could do for our users right now is put up a big giant we're all going to die, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Well, that's where I do disagree with you. The thing is, both extremes are bad. The extreme of there's nothing to see here, go back to your daily lives. That's bad.
Oh, don't get me wrong. That's not what I'm saying.
Also,
definitely not saying that.
I understand. What I'm saying is I'm giving you both extremes. The one extreme is nothing to see here, go back to your lives. The other extreme is you're all going to die, so live for the moment. Right. The point is both of those extremes produce the same result. We need to find the happy space in between.
And that's why
that's my point.
Right. No, and we are absolutely in agreement. That is why I think it's so important that we enable our users. They have to know they're the front line of defense with cybersecurity. Every organization, regardless if it's government, military, private sector, finance, healthcare, the trenches are secured by the general user. So when we plaster up, like you said, these, live life to the fullest, because who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. We put forward these very complex and systemic issues and risks. And the context is, we don't know what to do now. I guess we have to look to our business leaders. We have to look to our cyber leaders. We have to look to these very complex institutions for solutions. When you and I both know, day in and day out, a system and organization infrastructure is secured by the user.
Right. And while I, again, mostly agree with you, I mean, there's no question. The biggest gaping hole in every information system is the human factor. We've had videos on that. You and I have talked about that ad nauseum. There's no question. There is no bigger weakness than the human factor. But it's not like that isn't true of everything. I mean, so what do we do? Eliminate. I mean, that's like the horror plot of when AI and robots take over the world. You are what's wrong with this planet. We must kill the humans. I mean, we can't say that that's the whole thing. Now, I've talked about, zero trust architecture quite a bit. And one of the goals of a zero trust architecture is to reduce the dependency on that endpoint, reduce the role of that endpoint in the security infrastructure. I mean, you've heard me talk about this before. Amazon does not care if you have the latest patches on your endpoint when you visit their website because they don't trust your endpoint anyway. If we build our architectures more around that sort of thinking, it would cut a lot of that out. So, but that still doesn't mean that these organizations are completely, resilient and impossible to be hacked. It's simply not true. It's just, we can do things to lower the risk of the human factor when it comes to the general user population. There's an architectural solution for that problem in many, not all, but many instances.
No doubt.
But getting back to this whole calamity howler thing, though, there is a value in getting decision makers adequately, not excessively, but adequately scared. They need to be a little scared. They need to not be so confident that nothing's going to happen to their business, to their organization. And if it takes a little bit of an extreme sometimes to wake them up, maybe.
So forgive me for attempting to delve into the minds of the business leaders out there, the 70 some odd, percent of the business leaders out there that don't believe that cybersecurity is worth their time, money, and that it's worth their time to invest in or their money to invest in. However, I think you don't give them enough credit. I think that there is a business calculation that is done that they believe, hey, I've looked into it. I don't see it. It's just not there. I'm making a lot of money, or I'm providing a product, I'm providing a service. And by focusing on cybersecurity or increasing my focus on cybersecurity, that's going to hurt my business. Period. End of story.
Right.
I think that there's.
It's funny.
I think that there.
When we
go ahead.
Yeah, when we teach risk analysis and risk calculations, particularly quantitative risk analysis, I cover it in the CISSP boot camp. It's just as an example, but it's not the only place. But we do risk calculations, and what you're describing is a risk calculation where they're looking at their exposure factor as being way less than what it actually is, and the cost of security controls as being way more. And I think that's where some of the miscalculation in the lack of awareness that's out there. We talked about this a few minutes ago. The idea that everybody has to do everything is like, okay, you need to take the entire NIST 800 series and apply it to your system, in great detail. Well, we've seen how some organizations have tried to apply NIST, and they've created a monstrosity of bureaucracy while entirely missing the whole point of a risk framework. Completely missing the point. They just turned it into more rules and more things, and everyone looks at that and says, oh my goodness, this is going to put us out of business. And in the private sector, someone definitely looks at it. I just saw a recent report where business leaders were asked whether or not they agreed that they need to apply the cybersecurity framework to their organizations. And what came out of that survey was very simply this. The business leaders all agreed that it was a best practice and something that is aspirational. But the overwhelming majority believed that they couldn't afford to do it. They couldn't afford to do it. So it's just saying what you're saying, but from a different angle. They think that the only way to do it is to do it all. That there's no such thing as right sizing, which is something that I actually can't stand hearing that sentiment out there. It drives me crazy.
Well, there's a miscommunication factor. And I think that there's a miscommunication because there are cyber leaders that are out there that truly in their core believe this to be true. And there are other cyber leaders, not to cast aspersions, but there's other cyber leaders that utilize this as their springboard for additional revenue. And the fact is that right now, what's being sold to business leaders right now is that technology has to be secure first, right? Your network has to be secure. Security starts at the network, right? Security starts at the asset level. Security starts at the application level. And we both know that there are multiple ways to get around every single one of those safeguards that are implemented. And I think that cost that we're talking about comes from the implementation of new hardware, new software, these brand new solutions that are out there that are sold as the golden ticket, right? The golden box that will secure all your woes.
The golden ticket,
right? That's where that cost comes
from.
And
that is frankly the problem, because part of our business model. Again, I hate to plug our business model, but part of our business model is we don't sell a product. But if you're one of these companies that's your whole business is selling products, then that's your myopic focus. That's all you see. So, it goes back to grandma's computer. No one wants to spend $100 million to protect, grandma's computer, because grandma's computer didn't have anything that valuable on it. And business leaders will always calculate what they can afford to lose. They will always make that calculation. Even manufacturers will put a product out there thinking, probably X% of these are going to fail. But instead of doing a root cause analysis on this design right now, let's wait for someone out there to find what's wrong with the system, and they'll send it back to us, and we'll give them all rebates. But when we run the numbers, we realize that all of the recall costs, all of the bringing it back and fixing it for free, all of that is less than the cost of doing the advanced activities. So they say, we'll take the risk. We'll deal with it if it comes back, because who knows? Maybe it doesn't come back at all. Maybe it's fine. Maybe skipping that last round of QC, is saving us money and not costing us a dime. They will always make that calculation, and they make that calculation with cybersecurity ad nauseum because they're not afraid enough. They think they can handle it.
Yeah, I agreed. But posting up a big sign that says catastrophic events going to happen in 2 years to a lot of these business leaders, they're going to shrug, because ultimately, what are we talking about? When we talk about catastrophic incidents in cybersecurity, we're talking about attacks on infrastructure, right? We're talking about attacks on infrastructure. We are talking about attacks on the energy grid, on gas pipelines, on nuclear power plants. And those things have a very robust regulatory framework. As much in its infancy as cybersecurity as it is, it's still there, it's still in place, and it's becoming more and more robust. I think the issue that a lot of business leaders are not seeing right now, they're missing the trees for the forest, so to speak, right? Is that there is a major blind spot in a lot of our defense, when it not just our defense for infrastructure, but organizational defense for cybersecurity, and that's geopolitics. We have no idea how many 0 days China has just waiting in the wings to exploit somebody, anybody, anything at a whim, right? We've seen Russia in the last year do a number of things, or at least attempt to do a number of cyber attacks that have, for the most part, failed. And there's a reason for that, right? Because we have security, not to say that we don't have to worry about it. We absolutely have to worry about it. But the infrastructure to secure those critical parts of our economy, of our energy sources, they're there. They're in motion. We don't have that for organizations, though. We don't have that for businesses. We don't have that for small businesses in the least.
Right.
And that becomes a problem.
You're not wrong. And frankly, instead of being this doom and gloom sayer that people just discount entirely, it probably would make more sense if the headline said, "You will lose 10 times your cybersecurity budget the next time you are hacked."
Right.
Just something like that,
right,
which is actually more realistic, you will lose 10 times your cybersecurity budget when you're breached.
Yeah, and that's where,
maybe 100 times your cybersecurity budget.
That's the disconnect.
That's the disconnect. That's the relevance. But that's the relevance that they need to see. Right. It's like, okay, you're scared to spend X on cybersecurity, but what is the cost of not? And that's the message that's not conveyed when people go to the extreme and saying in 2 years there will be a global catastrophe caused by cyber attack. I mean, that's the real problem that I see with that whole approach. But at the same time, I know that feeling invincible, feeling like it's not going to happen to me, it's not going to happen to my company, my guys know what they're doing. Oh, I have good cybersecurity. Oh, I hired Cisco or SolarWinds or whoever they may have hired. That somehow or another they have the golden ticket. That sort of hubris needs to be taken down a peg, because that's the sort of thing that gets businesses in trouble and that gets their non-technically sophisticated CIO laid off.
Or the CISO, for that matter, right?
Shown the door.
That's the disconnect.
The CISOs very often also.
Well, that's the disconnect, right? Is when you see
are lacking enough awareness.
I think this is reasonable to expect that when a business leader sees the headline, or even any layman sees the headline, catastrophic mutating cybersecurity threat will strike in 2023. They're going to look at that, and there will be a disconnect, but especially if they are not in critical infrastructure. And you look at where a lot of the known threats are coming from. The Davos report, or the World Economic Forum report, the Outlook for 2023, specifically talks about how cyber criminals are merging with nation state actors, right? And we've known this for a while. We did an episode on this a while ago where we talk about cyber criminality, where it stems from, what it's funded by, yada yada yada. But ultimately, what we're starting to see is we're looking at less actual damage to an organization's infrastructure, as we're seeing like reputational risk at stake, right? Cisco is one of the business leaders and one of the cyber leaders that I think understands this pretty well, because they've been targeted by known nation state actors that are sponsored by Russia, I think since they pulled out of Russia. Right? It's been a while. So they understand that. But a basic organization, anybody in the private sector that doesn't directly deal with infrastructure or critical infrastructure, I don't think understands that or sees that or makes that connection when they read the headline, catastrophic mutate, so on and so forth. They say, hey, that's the big boys, or that's these guys over here. That doesn't matter to my, hospital network. Right? When it absolutely does, because it causes chaos. It ruins the reputation of known, reliable solutions. And that's all that a lot of these nation states or criminals are looking to do. So there's a communication thing that we have to fix.
Even more than that, though, a 0 day doesn't stay a 0 day forever. It's the propagation of the knowledge that creates the risk lower down the food chain. And the bottom line is, when NSA cyber weapons found their way into the dark web, there was a glut of attacks on regular people and regular systems and small businesses and medium-sized businesses, because once that those attack methodologies were in the cyber criminal community, then they didn't have to invent a new attack vector. They got one from the NSA. They got one from these state-sponsored entities that were doing research in cyber weapons, and then someone, does what they do as far as breaching the trust that they establish with their organization and sharing that stuff with whomever, and then you get a whole lot of other issues. So the thing that should scare people in a more proximal way is the fact that these things are possible. And if these things are possible, forget about the targeting of the nuclear reactor or the bioresearch facility or the pipelines or all the other things that would create a nightmare event, a disaster event. And just think about the fact that those tools, if used against you, could be devastating to what you value. And they're out there. That's where, I do agree that the hyperbolic statements do more harm than good. But the fear that they're designed to provoke is not entirely off target.
Yeah.
People need to be afraid.
We can absolutely delete this section if it gets too political here, 100%. But I liken a lot of this to how the messaging for climate change is packaged and delivered to the layman, right? It's very catastrophic. It's, the headlines are, the Amazon rainforest will burn down to a crisp by 2035, and fresh water, water is no longer safe to drink, and so on and so forth. And it creates a malaise, and it's overwhelming for people. There's an actual a term for this in psychology called apocalypse fatigue, where people have to make never-ending decisions on an everyday basis to attack these ginormous, complex, systemic problems. And that leads to fatigue. It leads to malaise. It leads to people becoming ambivalent about the very giant risk that is out there. I think that's what's happening with cybersecurity right now, is we're getting these big, giant headlines about that are catastrophizing maybe overly so, very real issues, putting it out there so that the layman reads that. And we have seen that time and time again. How many data breaches were in the news just this last week? How many people have had their identities stolen? How many people were affected by the latest breach with LastPass or Experian or Lowe's, Home Depot? Again, how many times in the last year has that happened? We've seen headlines almost on a daily basis talking about a data breach, and there's a point where people tune it out. And and I think
we're past that point, but that's why we're here.
Yeah, that's why
we have a job.
That's the point of the cyber guys, right? Because we want to try to communicate these things,
put it in perspective, put it in reality. There are certainly people who need to be scared, right? There's certain business leaders that need a Christmas Carol type event, right? Where they are visited by the ghost of cybersecurity past and present and future to fully explain this to them. But the everyday person doesn't need that. The everyday person needs to understand what their part is to play here, how they can be defensive about these things. Organizations need to talk to their general users and empower those general users as opposed to scaring them or fear mongering. And so, that's why we're here. That's part of why we're doing this podcast, right? That's to kind of gain that perspective. It, man. That's it. And we need to do next time. Let's actually look at what they really did say in Davos, and maybe just kind of go frame by frame and break down. Okay, what did they actually say, and let's put it all in the context. Let's do that.
I would love to sit down. Let's go look at the forum. We'll take a look at the forum. We'll look at how business leaders, international leaders, are protecting cyberspace and amid exponential change. So that's going to do it for this episode of the Cyber Guys. Look, we love doing these episodes. So if you like this episode, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you can see all the new content that we're coming out with every single week. Remember, stay safe, be secure, be sure. We'll see you next time.
Take care.